Hey, again, like Derek said, we really mean it when we say wherever you are and whatever you come in with, whatever your life looks like right now, we're really, really glad that you're here. And I'm really, really glad that you're here and that we can be here together this morning. My name's Joel, if we haven't met yet. And I just want to ask you a question. When was the last time you were just in a really uncomfortable situation? Whether you caused it or you found yourself you were just in an awkward situation that you wanted more than anything just to get out of. Can you think of it? Maybe it was this week. Maybe it was even this morning. Maybe it was this month. This past week, I was in a Starbucks drive-thru, and I saw one of the baristas there at the window that I hadn't seen in a long time, and I was really excited. His name is Josh, and I need to be careful because our community is small enough. He might be here this morning, but his name was Josh, and I was really excited. I was like, man, I get to say hi to Josh. I get to ask him about his life, and I remembered that Josh had a long-distance girlfriend, and my wife and I were long-distance for a long time, so we kind of connected over that. We talk about that from time to time, and I was really, really excited. I was like, awesome, I see Josh. I'm going to ask about his girlfriend. This is great. So he hands me my drink, and we have a short encounter, and then I say, hey, Josh, how's your girlfriend? And he returns with this look and it both kind of set in yeah, Josh doesn't have a girlfriend anymore. And I just brought it up in this sad guy now. And I was just trying, and then the rest of the time I was just trying to recover it then. It's like, yeah, that's great. Like, God loves you, man, and I love you. And so you don't need a girlfriend, It's like I said something really stupid. And my wife is just kind of she's like, okay, we just need to leave. This is awkward. It was just awkward. It's just awkward. I've been in a couple airports the last couple of weeks, and there's just awkward things you see in airports. There was a guy had a freezer bag. You can get vegetables in a freezer bag, and you pop them in the microwave, and they're perfect. Well, this guy didn't need a microwave to eat his freezer bag green beans, and we're just waiting to board our flight back home, and he's just eating green beans out of the freezer bag, and it's just a little awkward. It's just a little uncomfortable for everyone else besides yourself. It's just awkward. And when we're in those, right, we try as hard as we can to get comfortable again. We try as hard as we can to make the situation not awkward, whether that's giving a really cheesy church answer to a barista, or maybe that's avoiding the guy eating raw green beans. But we try to get out of these situations, and I'm surprised at the lengths sometimes we go to get comfortable. Like in airplanes, right? A couple weeks ago, I was flying home from Florida on vacation, and I had grabbed my backpack and wrapped it in my wife's coat and was hugging it while I'm leaning against the airplane, and we're taking off, and it's like this, and I'm just trying to get comfortable. I'm just trying to get a couple minutes of sleep, and I'm somewhere along the way, I was I just look ridiculous. I'm just going to stop, Someone was really bright and tried to help our society become more comfortable, and they invented this, the Snuggie. Anybody ever seen a Snuggie? Who's worn a Snuggie? Raise your hand, please. Yes. I have worn a Snuggie. We owned a Snuggie. It was a leopard print Snuggie. Here's one in action if you haven't seen what they're supposed to look like. And really, someone just got smart and decided you could just flip a bathrobe backwards and wear it and then make money off of it. So it was a really sustainable business model. It was really great. But we go to pretty far lengths to get comfortable, to be comfortable. And that's true physically, but it's true if you're anything like me in life too. There's some situations that are just awkward, and there's times we bump up against things that we feel stretched and we feel discomfort, and we shy away from it. And we say, man, I just want to be comfortable. I just want to pursue comfort in my life. And again, that can be all kinds of different things, situationally, relationally, emotional comfort. We like that safety. We like that feeling of security. And if I were to define it for you, if you're a note taker here today, I would define living comfortably, or living in a place of comfort in our lives, when life is easy and when life is predictable. When life is easy, when there's this ease in our lives of going through life and situations and people, when that's easy, when it comes without too much hassle. And then when it's predictable, when we can kind of see what's coming next, we can expect what's going to happen. When life is easy and predictable, we might be living a life centered around comfort. Pastor John introed a thought in a series this month that we'll be in called Schemes. And one of the schemes that I believe some of us can live in is the scheme of comfort. Here's what I mean by that. Pastor John outlined last week of how idols can come into our life. How these things that set themselves up against God can creep into our life through these schemes. That somewhere along the way they enter our life, and before we know it, we're living in this pattern, we're living in this scheme, and we're giving a lot of attention and authority to this thing or this person in our life. It becomes an idol. It sets itself up against God and his rightful place in our lives. There was a couple definitions we looked at of an idol, and here's a couple just on the screen. Whatever we give excessive authority to direct our lives, whatever we kind of hand the keys or the steering wheel of our life and say, that's you make the shots, that might be an idol in our life. Whatever we follow without even considering what Jesus says or invites us into. And then whatever causes us to disregard Jesus when we do hear what he says or what he invites us into. There's these idols, there's these things that if we're not careful can steal our attention and our love and our affection and our passion. And they set themselves up in the place of Jesus. And we looked at Joshua chapter 24. Joshua's in the Old Testament of the Bible, and it's really the story of God's people entering the promised land. And what we'll look at in just a few moments is this truth, that just like in our lives and just like comfort can be an idol in our lives, comfort can actually start to stifle things in our lives. Comfort can actually stifle things. Just for a moment, I want to share with you two stories from an article about businesses that comfort stifled. Okay, so if you don't believe me, like on a spiritual level, if you know anything about business, just track with me for a second. How many have heard of the company of Blockbuster? Anybody heard of Blockbuster? I think as of this week, there is one Blockbuster left in the U.S., the last Blockbuster. I want to read this to you. This is out of a business magazine. It says this: Blockbuster is an organization whose unfortunate demise was due to their failure to innovate. Blockbuster provided a video games and home movie rental service, which was particularly popular in America. It is easy to understand why Blockbuster enjoyed so much success. They offered an easy way for consumers to access the games and movies that they wanted most. However, as the world became more technologically oriented, Blockbuster failed to follow suit. They continued to offer their in-store service to for a number of reasons, which to many seem somewhat foolish. Blockbuster believed, according to their data, that people liked and arguably preferred the in-store experience, going into their stores. Blockbuster felt that their customers enjoyed the experience of opening their games so that they could see the contents in their entirety. As a result of their decision, Netflix, anybody heard of Netflix? Netflix managed to soar past them as they attracted millions of keen customers who wanted to view their movies or favorite shows on their own devices. In summary, Blockbuster's reluctance to update their sales strategy is what eventually led to their demise. They got comfortable. Here's another one, BlackBerry. Anybody ever owned a BlackBerry? I was not cool to own such a chunky device with loud keyboard, but I was very jealous of all my friends who had a BlackBerry. Here's a description about what happened to BlackBerry. Once the device of choice for professionals, BlackBerry failed to adapt to a changing market and customer demands. Actively rejecting the touchscreen. How many of us have a touchsceen? Actively rejecting the touchscreen, BlackBerry popularized by smartphones such as the iPhone, BlackBerry was left behind. As consumers enjoyed the freedom and ease of use offered by a touchscreen in their personal lives, a shift in workplace policy arose as bring your own device, and it became standard. In a similar manner to Blockbuster, BlackBerry failed to address shifts in consumer demands which allowed them to be overtaken by their rivals and left playing catch-up. They got comfortable. Blockbuster found a process and a type of store, a type of environment that worked for a time. And even at some time, it was kind of edgy in its time. It was innovative. BlackBerry created this clunky device, which they were sure was going to make sales and sure that they just held on, it was going to make it. They were going to make it. And eventually those companies kind of went under. I think it illustrates this truth that comfort can kill. Comfort can kill. If we let it, whether it's a business, whether it's in a relationship, whether it's in a job, comfort, we just focus on comfort. Sometimes that can kill. There was a study done of about 50 individuals over the age of 95. Really interesting to hear people from that age talk about life and what they would have hoped to be. And they said this, 50 people over the age of 95 that came back, their results in 3 themes of answers. Here was what they were. The question was, if you could live your life all over again, what would you do differently? The responses were, if I could do it all over again, 1, I would reflect more. I would reflect more. That's a good thing. I mean, self-thought and meditation, that's a hot topic today. I'd reflect more. That's 1. 2, if I could do it all over again, I would risk more. I'd take more risks. Then the last one, if I could do it all over again, this is powerful. I would do more things that would live on after I'm dead. I'd do more things that live on past my lifetime. I'd reflect more. I'd risk more. I'd do more things that live on past me. And those examples, they just kind of make me think of this. And this question is not original to me, but it's this question. Are you actually satisfied? Or are you just comfortable? Are you actually satisfied? Or are you just comfortable? Do we walk into this place and say, I'm living the fullness. I'm squeezing everything out of life right now that I can. I'm living the fullness of what Jesus has for me or what life has for me. Or have we just found some patterns? Have we just found some ways of life that they work? They're predictable. We know what the result will be. Are we actually satisfied? Or are we just comfortable? Kind of a provoking question for you to ask yourself and myself. I want to look at the story of Israel, God's people in the Old Testament. Joshua 24. We were in this passage last week. Joshua 24, starting in verse 14. It's on page 162 if have a Bible like this. And it's really the story of God's people as they enter the promised land. They're just getting established into the promised land. And Joshua, the leader of God's people, gives the nation some commands. It says this in verse 14. Now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshiped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors worshiped beyond the Euphrates or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. Verse 19, Joshua said to the people, you are not able to serve the Lord your God. He is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your rebellion and your sins. If you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, he will turn and bring disaster on you and make an end of you after he has been good to you. But the people said to Joshua, no, we will serve the Lord. Then Joshua said, you are witnesses against yourself that you've chosen to serve the Lord. Yes, we are witnesses. Then Joshua says this, Now then, said Joshua, throw away the foreign gods that are among you and yield your hearts. Give your hearts to the Lord, the God of Israel. It's this really powerful moment. There's been all these years of trying to get to this place for this nation, and they're finally here. And Joshua says, hey, before you take the land, before we get set up here, yield your heart again. Yield your hearts to the Lord. Throw away those foreign gods, those things that would set themselves up against God. And then the last verse of this chapter, in verse 28, or in the last verse of this section, verse 28, says this, Then Joshua dismissed the people, each to their own inheritance. Then Joshua dismissed the people, each to their own inheritance. Now, you and I are pretty familiar with wills or inheritances in our culture, but for that culture, what you were given as an inheritance was really your starting place for life. If you were given from your father figure, from your family line, an inheritance, that's really what you had to work with to start out your life and your family and your legacy. And so when Joshua says, go each to your own inheritance, it's really their portion, their section of this vast land, this prosperous land that God had provided for his people. It was really their individual calling, their specific calling into the larger calling that God had given the people. And it's kind of like us, right? We look at the world's huge. There's over 7 billion people in the world. And we look at our little sliver of life. We look at our little sliver of eternity. And that's like, in a way, our own inheritance, right? God gives it to us as a gift. We believe God creates us and he gives us life. And then he calls us to be a steward of that life. Just like you and I have that life, they were walking into the same thing. They had this inheritance that Joshua was sending them to, encouraging them to live out. And he says, hey, throw away those gods and yield your hearts to the Lord. And he sends them to their own inheritance. And just like they were designed for that, just like God had promised that for his people, you and I were designed and promised this life of calling. You and I were designed a life of calling. As we follow God, as we understand our purpose and our passions and our personality that God has created us for, we realize that we're designed for this life of calling. This life of calling. To experience, if you will, the inheritance that Jesus has created for each one of us. See, comfort is not a bad thing. Comfort's not a bad thing at all. But it's designed to be in that life of calling that Jesus has created, not to be the calling itself. It's supposed to be a part of that. And we're designed for a life of calling. I want to take you back to that study I referenced earlier. These are the 3 results from those interviews. 50 people over the age of 95 said I would reflect more, I would risk more, and I do more things that live on after I'm dead. More things that would outlast me, my resources, my time on earth. I'd invest in things that are far beyond my little inheritance, my little portion of eternity. I believe that whether those people believed in Jesus, had lived lives of faith, I have no idea, but I believe it points to the spiritual principle that you and I were created for a life of calling. Let's go to Ephesians chapter 2. If you have a phone or a Bible, Ephesians chapter 2, it's in the New Testament. And the Apostle Paul was really this church planter. He was this church leader who planted all these new churches, these communities of Jesus followers. His life was radically changed. And then we have in the New Testament a bunch of letters he's written to these churches. And this is one of those letters, Ephesians 2, starting in verse 8. It says this, God saved you by his grace when you believed. And you can't take credit for this. It is a gift from God. Salvation is not a reward for the good things we have done, so none of us can boast about it, for we are God's masterpiece. Some translations say workmanship or handiwork. We are God's masterpiece. He has created us anew in Christ Jesus, so we can do the good things he has planned for us long ago. You see it there? You see this theme of this calling, these good things, each one created in Christ for. It's this reality that you and I were not created on an assembly line, but you're created in a studio. Here's what I mean by that. You weren't created on an assembly line. You're created in a studio. A lot of us, when we consider life, right? It's a huge planet we live in. There's lots of people. There's lots of things happening. And if we're not careful, we can kind of see our lives as created by Jesus on this assembly line, where it's all about efficiency and getting the next one done. And before you know it, another life is created. It's just all these lives created without meaning, right? They're all the same. It meets this uniformity. but less like a assembly line and more like a studio. That's how you and I were created. The scriptures in Jeremiah through a prophet even use this picture of God as the potter and we are the clay. There's this intentionality, this uniqueness to our lives. Just like Paul said that you're a masterpiece, the same is true. You weren't created on an assembly line. I wasn't created on an assembly line. We're created in a studio with all this intention, all this purpose, all this uniqueness, and all this calling, this unique calling to influence the world, our time and place in it. You weren't made on an assembly line. You're made in a studio. Maybe some of us just need to absorb that a little bit. Maybe we've fallen into this rhythm of life where it's just easy to get overwhelmed by the bigness of life and the bigness of God and the bigness of the planet we live in. Before we know it, we can miss the uniqueness, the specialization that God has created each one of us with, to do the good works, like Paul said, that were created in advance. See, comfort, if we're not careful, comfort can stifle some of that personality, some of that uniqueness that God has created, some of those passions and the giftings God has created each one of us for. And comfort isn't a bad thing. Don't hear what I'm not saying. Comfort is not a bad thing. Comfort was designed to be inside of the life Jesus created for, not to be the goal of life itself. Comfort was designed to be experienced and encountered and received within the life Jesus created us for, not to be the goal of that life itself. And maybe you're here this morning and you would not consider yourself a spiritual person or a Jesus follower. Let me just encourage you. Comfort can kill is a principle that stretches far beyond just following Jesus. I really believe that. Just like those businesses showed that when we get comfortable, some of our personality and some of the passions and things we were made for in life just get stifled. They just get empty a little bit. Jesus designed comfort to be a real and experienced part of our lives. But I just encourage us today that maybe that's not supposed to be the goal of life itself. But true comfort comes from two places. True comfort comes from two places. The first, very, very churchy answer for a lot of us is from Jesus, right? Comfort, church comes from Jesus, but comfort does also. Comfort comes from Jesus. Jesus is the source of true comfort, of lasting comfort. Psalm says this, David in the Psalms, right, says, "May your unfailing love be my comfort, according to your promise to your servant." Comfort comes from Jesus. Jesus is the source of comfort. The Spirit of Jesus in the New Testament is called the Comforter. That's the role it plays. He's very much the source of comfort. And maybe some of us are here today and we need that comfort. Jesus is the source of that comfort. The first place we get true comfort is from Jesus. The second is from other people. We receive comfort. See, we weren't meant to build comfort. We weren't meant to manufacture comfort. We weren't meant to guard comfort. We were meant to receive comfort. Receive comfort from Jesus, from the source of that comfort, and from other people. Jesus is the source of that comfort. And he gives it to and through other people. When we try to guard that and protect it and produce it, our lives and the calling that Jesus has placed on them, the unique influence and difference he's called to make in the world, just gets stifled, gets blocked in. It gets inside this little bubble we could call a comfort zone. Jesus designed comfort to be a real part of the life he created us for, but not the goal of that life itself. Not the goal, not the ultimate, not the excessive authority, not to be the idol, not to be the one that calls all the shots. Comfort is a gift from God. But Jesus just asked us today, maybe it wouldn't be God for us. There was an author, a Christian author, that says this: life begins at the end of your comfort zone. Life begins at the end of your comfort zone. The good things in life, the exciting, the adventurous part of life begins on the edge, the outside, beyond our comfort zone. If we're not careful, we can build this little bubble of comfort. Before we know it, we're 95 and we're saying things like, I wish I would have reflected. I wish I would have risked more. I wish I would have invested things that lasted far beyond me. Maybe Jesus would just say, hey, could I be the source of your comfort? Could you receive that from me and from other people and not try to build it yourself, not try to build this security yourself? Would you just receive it? There's a story in the New Testament that a lot of us would probably be familiar with. It's of Jesus and his disciples, and specifically one of his disciples named Peter. And I just want to read it for us. It'll be on the screen. And I think it just shows this. It gives us a really interesting window into this theme of comfort. It says this, Matthew 14:22. It says this. Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. This is not a metaphor. This is not like an allegory. Jesus is walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified, as we would be. It's a ghost, they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, take courage. Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid. Lord, if it's you, Peter replied, tell me to come to you on the water. Come, he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. This is not a metaphor. There are two humans walking on the water here. And if you know the story, eventually you know Peter starts to doubt and he gets his eyes off of Jesus and he starts to sink and Jesus has to save him. But there's this really powerful moment that Peter says, Lord, if it's you, if it's really you, if you are who you say you are, if you can do what you can say you can do, then tell me to come to you and I'm going to respond. And there's this moment where it says Peter got down out of the boat. He takes this step towards Jesus. And maybe some of us today, our comfort zone, whatever we would define comfort as, this ease and this predictability of our lives, and maybe the dreams and the passions and the newness and the change and the vision that's just gotten stifled by this idol of comfort. Maybe that would be the boat today that Jesus would just say, can you take a step out of? Can you take a step out of? Away from that and toward me? And maybe like Peter, maybe as some of us do that, we'll walk through this week and we'll walk through today and it'll be like we're walking on that water. There'll be that experience with Jesus that has never happened before. Peter wasn't like a water walker. That was not his routine thing. But he takes this step towards Jesus. There's this powerful moment where the eyes are locked and he's walking toward Jesus. And maybe some of us today, the boat would represent our comfort zone. And Jesus would just say, hey, would you step out? Would you take a step? Maybe that's praying a prayer. Maybe that's having a conversation. Maybe that's raising your hand for something and getting involved in something. I don't know what it is for you. But if you're anything like me, the temptation to pursue comfort on my own, to build comfort and build security, it's just a little too easy. And I'd love to pray and just open up a little bit of space for us to receive comfort from Jesus and have him invite us out of the boat. What we're going to do is our team's going to come. They're going to come right now, and they're going to sing a song called Oceans, which really paints a very cool picture of this scripture we just read. It puts it to word and melody in a way that I just hope you can almost receive from Jesus and make it your prayer and turn it back to him as a prayer. There's a lot of good truths in the song. One of the lines says this in the bridge: Spirit, lead me where my trust is without borders. Let me walk upon the waters wherever you would call me. Maybe when we get to that part, that could just be our prayer individually and collectively this morning. And I just invite you to stay seated, and kind of absorb these words. Let it be our prayer this morning, right to Jesus, more than a song, but really just a prayer, an open heart today. We just kind of consider, how is Jesus inviting me to lay down the idol of comfort? Let's turn our hearts to him and focus on Jesus this morning, his voice.